My name is Dorothy. I am 72 years old, and I have spent most of my adult life knitting. Not as a hobby, the way people take up yoga or learn to bake sourdough. I mean, I have been knitting since I was 11 years old, sitting at my mother's knee in a farmhouse outside Terre Haute, Indiana, watching her hands move through the yarn like they were speaking a language the rest of the world had forgotten. Every baby in our family came into this world wrapped in something one of us had made. It was not tradition for tradition's sake. It was how we said, "You are loved," before you even know what love is. So when my son Daniel called to tell me that his wife, Amber, was pregnant, the first thing I did after I hung up the phone was go to my knitting basket and start thinking about colors. I had been waiting 3 years for that call. 3 years since my husband Frank passed. 3 years of quiet evenings and an empty chair at the kitchen table. And suddenly, there was going to be a baby, my first grandchild. And then, one night in the fall, Daniel and Amber came over for dinner, and Amber sat across from me with that particular smile she wore when she had already decided something. She told me she was going to have a baby shower in the spring. All her friends, a catered spread, the works. She was very excited. I told her I was excited too, and I meant it. I told her I had already started a blanket. She smiled again, the polished kind, and said that was sweet. What she did not know, what none of them knew, was what I had folded inside that blanket. And that night, 9 days after the shower, the phone rang, and it was Daniel, and his voice was the voice of a man whose world had just rearranged itself completely. He said, "Mom, what was inside that blanket?" And I have thought about how I am going to tell this story ever since. If any part of this has ever touched your heart, I hope you will stay with me. Leave a comment and tell me where you are watching from, and whether you have ever had someone treat something precious to you like it was nothing. You cannot imagine what it means to know someone is out there listening. Let me take you back to the beginning. Frank and I had been married for 42 years when he got sick. Pancreatic cancer moves fast, and it does not ask permission. And so by the time we understood what we were dealing with, there was not much time left for the long conversations we had always told ourselves we would have someday. But Frank was the most practical man I ever knew. He did not waste what remained. He spent every hour on what mattered. One of the things he said to me in the last few weeks, lying in the hospital bed we had set up in the living room so he could see the backyard, was this: "Dorothy, if I am not here to see our first grandchild, I want to write something for them. A letter. Something they can read when they are old enough to understand it. Something real that I wrote with my own hand." I told him we would do it together. He shook his head. He said, "No, you write it for me. You always found the words I could not." So I wrote it. The two of us worked on it over 3 evenings. Him in his chair by the window in the afternoon light, talking slowly, stopping to cough, reaching for the glass of water on the tray. Me at the kitchen table with a yellow legal pad, writing it all down in his voice, as faithfully as I could manage, which is the hardest kind of writing there is. He told me about the things he had learned the slow way, the things he wished someone had told him when he was young, the things he most wanted his grandchild to know about who he was and where he came from and what he believed. He spoke about honesty and patience and the value of physical work. He spoke about Frank's own father, who had farmed 40 acres of Indiana clay without complaint for 50 years and never once asked for recognition. He spoke about love, what it actually is underneath the sentiment. Mostly, just showing up when it is inconvenient. He read each draft I brought him and made small corrections in pencil. When he was satisfied, he signed it at the bottom, his name in the careful cursive he had learned as a child, much more deliberate and formal than his everyday signature. We sealed it in an envelope with his name on the front, written in his handwriting, not mine. Frank passed in October, 3 years before the baby shower. I kept that letter in the cedar chest at the foot of my bed, the one his mother gave us as a wedding gift. Dark, solid walnut with brass hardware that I polish every spring. It sat there under the quilt I had made for our 25th anniversary, and several other things I had kept for years without quite being able to explain why. I thought about the letter on hard nights. I thought about what it would mean for a child to grow up, to become a teenager and then a young adult, and to open it someday and hear their grandfather's voice for the first time. The knitting for the baby blanket took me 4 months. I started in December, right after the new year felt close enough to imagine, and I finished in late March, 3 weeks before the baby shower. I used a soft merino wool I ordered from a small supplier in Vermont, a weight that is gentle enough for a newborn skin. Cream and sage green, because I did not know whether the baby was going to be a boy or a girl, and because those were the colors my mother had used for every first baby in our family as far back as anyone could remember, going back at least to my grandmother. There is a stitch pattern my mother taught me for the border, small interlocking diamonds that I have never seen in any book. She learned it from her mother, who learned it from hers, and it exists only in the hands of the women in our family who have taken the time to pass it down. Each row was a small, deliberate thing. I am not a fast knitter. I count my stitches. I sit in the evenings after dinner, after the news, with the radio on low, and I work through a section at a time. 4 months meant roughly 120 evenings, give or take, though some were longer and some were just a few rows before bed. When I held it up in March and it was finished, it was about 30 inches by 36, the right size to swaddle a newborn and still have room. I folded it once to check the dimensions. I put it in the cedar chest for a moment, next to Frank's letter. That is when I made the decision about what was going to go inside it. I had been thinking about this for 2 years, since Daniel first mentioned that Amber was hoping they would start a family soon. Frank and I had owned a small piece of land outside Crawfordsville, Indiana, about 8 acres of mostly wooded ground with a creek running along the south edge and a meadow at the north end that turns golden in August. We bought it 30 years ago when the price was almost nothing, a few $1,000s, thinking we might someday build a small cabin for weekends. We never built the cabin. Life kept being full of other things. But the land had stayed ours, and over the years it had appreciated considerably. A real estate attorney I consulted estimated its fair market value at approximately $140,000. I wanted that land to belong to my grandchild. I had heard something mentioned once at a church event by a neighbor whose daughter practiced real estate law about the possibility of conveying property to an unborn child in Indiana. I was not sure of the specifics. I made an appointment and drove the 40 miles to Crawfordsville to see Margaret Holloway, a real estate attorney, whose office I had passed many times on my way to the hardware store without ever imagining I would need her. I sat across her desk with a cup of coffee going cold in my hands and told her what I had in mind. She told me it was unusual, but completely legal. In Indiana, a gift deed can be executed in favor of an unborn beneficiary, recorded with the county recorder, and the conveyance is valid. The child receives the property at birth. There are conditions, she explained, language that has to be precise, but it could be done, and done properly, and once filed, it would be irrevocable. She drafted the deed over the following 2 weeks. I reviewed it carefully. She walked me through each clause. We made one small adjustment to the language. And on a Tuesday in February, 6 weeks before the baby shower, I drove back to Crawfordsville, and we filed it with the Montgomery County Recorder's Office. I paid Margaret Holloway's fee that afternoon. I kept the certified copy of the recorded deed, stamped by the county, in a manila envelope. I placed it in the cedar chest, alongside Frank's letter and the finished blanket, and I told no one. Now, I want you to understand something about Amber. She is not a wicked person. I have thought about this carefully, and I do not believe she is cruel by nature. But she comes from a different world than I do, and she has different measures of what things are worth and why. In the 2 years since Daniel brought her home for the first time, she had made certain things clear without ever saying them plainly. The house they kept in Indianapolis was decorated with careful precision, everything coordinated, every surface curated. The kitchen appliances were all the same brand, a German one I had never heard of. She had strong opinions about what belonged in certain rooms and what did not. She had sent Daniel's family a list of approved products for the nursery. It was a polite list, framed as helpful guidance. It included specific brands for the crib, the mattress, the changing pad, the swaddle cloths, the sound machine. It did not include handmade items of any kind. I noticed that. I set the list aside and kept knitting. There was also the question of how she introduced me. In 2 years, at family dinners and one holiday, she had never called me Dorothy in front of others. I was always Daniel's mom. Once, memorably, Daniel's mother from Terre Haute, which is not a wrong thing to say, but is a particular way of situating a person at a distance. I did not make anything of it. Frank would have said, "Wait and see what she does, not what she says." I was waiting. The morning of the baby shower was a Saturday in April. I had driven the 90 miles from Terre Haute the evening before and stayed in a Holiday Inn near the interstate because I did not want to arrive tired or rushed. The dogwoods were blooming all along Daniel Street when I got there just before 10. There were cars parked half a block in each direction. Through the front window, I could see the room already full. About 30 women, as I counted them. Friends of Amber's from work, neighbors from their street in Indianapolis, her mother and her 2 sisters, her college roommate who had flown in from Portland. Several women I did not recognize. The house was decorated in gray and gold. There were enormous flower arrangements on every surface, white peonies and eucalyptus, the kind you order rather than cut. There were charcuterie boards the size of coffee tables. There was a dessert table with a custom cookie display featuring the baby's initials in royal icing. A photographer moved quietly through the rooms. Amber met me near the door. She looked beautiful, as she always does, her hair and makeup exactly right, wearing a pale blush dress that photographed well. She hugged me warmly. She thanked me for coming. She introduced me to the first 3 women she encountered as Daniel's mother. I smiled. I set my gift on the table with the others. I had wrapped the blanket in pale green tissue inside a white box with a simple card. I found a seat near the window and settled in. Daniel was there, one of only 2 men, standing a little awkwardly near the dining room door with a glass of water, looking the way men look at baby showers, as though they are guests in a country where they do not speak the language, but are trying to be respectful. He caught my eye across the room and smiled, and I smiled back, and that was most of our conversation until the parking lot. The gifts were opened after the food and the games, in a circle near the fireplace that had been arranged for exactly this purpose. Amber sat in a wide upholstered chair that someone had brought in from another room, and her sister knelt beside her to manage the pile, reading out the card names while Amber opened each box. It was a production. There was applause for each item. There was a sound machine that projected nature sounds, still in its box, that the room cooed over for a long time. There was a designer diaper bag in camel-colored leather that cost, I later checked, $380. There was a cashmere infant lovey imported from Scotland. There was the stroller, which required 4 people to carry in from wherever it had been stored, white with chrome accents, and which I looked up afterward and found priced at $1,390. I watched each gift receive its moment. I kept my expression pleasant. I drank my sparkling water. When they reached my box, Amber's sister read my name from the card. Amber smiled and lifted the lid. She drew back the tissue paper slowly, with both hands, and then she held the blanket up. She held it by the corner, 2 fingers, the way you might hold something you found under the couch and were not certain about. The room went quiet for just a moment, that particular quiet of a group of people deciding together how to feel. I watched Amber's face. I watched her eyes move over the pattern, the small interlocking diamonds on the border, the cream and sage that my grandmother's grandmother had used. And then she said it. "We only use designer things here," said, with a light laugh, easy and natural, as though it were a joke everyone was in on. And she set the blanket into the open trash can that had been placed beside her chair for torn wrapping paper and discarded ribbons. A few women laughed along. Most shifted back to their drinks. The photographer turned toward the next gift on the table. Daniel did not move. He was still near the dining room door, and he looked at the floor, and his jaw tightened, and he said nothing at all. I said nothing either. I held my face exactly where I had arranged it. I breathed in slowly through my nose. I thought about Frank, about what he would have said. I thought about the cedar chest. I thought about the manila envelope with the Montgomery County stamp on the front. And I thought, wait. Just wait. 20 minutes passed, perhaps 25. Amber moved on to the next gifts, exclaiming over each one with genuine delight, the room following her warmth the way rooms do when someone knows how to fill them. The photographer circulated, glasses were refilled. When the attention in the room had moved well away from the trash area, I stood up. I walked over to the can. I lifted out the blanket. I folded it carefully, the way I fold everything, with the border facing out, 3 even folds. I placed it in the tote bag I had brought with me. I smoothed the front of my cardigan and went back to my seat. Not one person said anything. Either no one saw, or everyone saw, and no one said anything. And I am not sure which of those possibilities says more. Either way, I sat back down, finished my sparkling water, and waited a decent amount of time before making my goodbyes. Have you ever had to leave a room where you were made to feel invisible? Not forgotten, not overlooked by accident, but deliberately placed at the edge of a gathering, and then looked through as though the decades behind your face had made you somehow transparent? I want you to know something. I have lived long enough to understand that a moment like that is not the end of anything. Sometimes, if you have been paying attention and doing the quiet work, it is the beginning. I said goodbye to Amber, who hugged me again warmly and thanked me for making the drive. I said goodbye to Daniel, who walked me to my car in the driveway and stood there with his hands in his jacket pockets, looking like he had something to say and could not locate it. I told him I loved him. I meant it completely. I drove home. 90 miles. I did not turn the radio on. I drove through the flat Indiana spring, the fields going green, the old farmhouses set back from the highway with their bare trees, and I thought about Frank's letter. I thought about Margaret Holloway sitting across from me in her office on a Tuesday in February, telling me that it was unusual, but completely legal. I thought about 8 acres with a creek along the south edge, already belonging to a child who had not yet been born. I thought about the women in that room, and the gray and gold decorations, and a trash can beside a fireplace, and what Amber thought she had thrown away. When I got home, I unlocked the door, hung my coat on the hook in the entryway, and went to the bedroom. I opened the cedar chest. The manila envelope was there, exactly where I had left it, next to Frank's sealed letter. I took the blanket from my tote bag and folded it one more time and laid it on top of the envelope. I pressed my hand flat against it for a moment, feeling the texture of the merino wool, the small raised diamonds of the border. 120 evenings of work. Then I closed the chest. I went to the kitchen and made a cup of tea. I sat in my chair by the window and watched the light change over the backyard in the long April evening. I thought about Frank and his chair in that same light, 3 years ago and more. I thought about everything he had said in those 3 evenings at the kitchen table, and all of it safely sealed, and a piece of Indiana land waiting for a child who did not know yet that it was there. I want to ask you something. Have you ever done something deliberately? Something no one witnessed, something you knew was right, and then held it quietly inside yourself without saying a word? Because sometimes the most powerful act a person can make is invisible. Sometimes patience looks like stillness, and what it actually is underneath is the most deliberate and clear-eyed kind of love there is. 9 days after the shower, on a Thursday evening, I was sitting in this same chair with my knitting in my lap, the radio on low, when the phone rang. It was Daniel. I knew from the first syllable that something had shifted. He said, "Mom, and then nothing for a moment. Then, one of the women from the shower sent me a text. She said she saw you take the blanket out of the trash. Is that true? I said, yes, that is true. He was quiet. Then he said, Mom, what was inside that blanket? I took one full breath before I answered. I want you to imagine that silence, the weight of it, 9 days of knowing something and being ready finally to say it. And then I said it as plainly and calmly as I could, the way you speak when you have had time to find the right words, and you do not want to add drama to what is already dramatic enough on its own. I told him about Frank's letter first. I told him how we had worked on it together in the evenings, in those last few weeks, how his father had sat in the chair by the window and talked while I wrote, how we had revised it, and Frank had signed the final version in his careful, deliberate cursive. I told him I had kept it in the cedar chest for 3 years. I told him it was addressed to his child by name, that we had written to our grandchild on the front in Frank's handwriting, and that it contained things Frank had wanted that child to know about who they came from and what that lineage meant. I told him that I had folded the letter into the center of the blanket, tucked between the layers, because that was what my mother had always done with the first blanket in our family. You fold something in, something real, something that cannot be purchased or replaced. And then I told him about the deed. I told him that on a Tuesday in February, 6 weeks before the shower, I had driven to Crawfordsville and met with a real estate attorney named Margaret Holloway, and that together we had filed a gift deed conveying the 8 acres of land outside Crawfordsville that Frank and I had owned for 30 years into the name of his unborn child. Recorded with the Montgomery County Recorder's Office, stamped and legal, irrevocable from the moment of filing. I told him that a certified copy of that recorded deed had been folded inside the blanket. There was a silence on the line that was different from the previous one. This one had weight and texture. I waded through it. He said, Dad's letter. She almost threw away Dad's letter. His voice broke on the word letter and did not come back together cleanly. I listened to him quietly, the way you listen when someone needs to feel the full size of something before they can move through it. I told him, nothing is lost. The letter is safe. The deed is recorded, and it cannot be undone. His child owns that land, has owned it since February, free and clear. And the only person who can ever change that is the child himself when he is grown. He said he was going to talk to Amber. I told him that was between the two of them. I did not tell him what to say. I did not draft the conversation for him. I raised one child in my life, and I tried to raise him to understand that the hardest conversations are also the most necessary ones, and that the people who matter to you deserve to hear the truth from you directly, without prompting. He knew what to do. He is, in ways that still catch me off guard when I see them, his father's son. Margaret Holloway confirmed for me in the days after, when I called to ask a clarifying question, what I already understood from our February meeting. The gift deed is irrevocable. It was filed before the baby was born. It is recorded. No party can undo it except the child in adulthood, by their own choice. The land belongs to my grandchild. Its fair market value is approximately $140,000, which is not nothing, which is 3 decades of a marriage holding on to a piece of ground for a reason that turned out to be this. The women who attended the shower have spoken to each other. That is how it works. Within a week of Daniel's call, I had heard from 2 of his aunts on Frank's side, from my neighbor with the attorney daughter, from 3 women at my church whose husbands know Daniel's colleagues. A story like this travels, and it changes a little with each telling, the way all stories do. But the center of it holds. Everyone who needed to know knows. Everyone who mattered understands what was inside the blanket. Everyone knows what was almost lost. I am not interested in Amber being publicly shamed. That is not what justice looks like to me. What I am interested in is my grandchild having what belongs to them, something that Frank and I built over 30 years, something that costs more in years than any price tag can represent, something their grandfather chose for them before he left. A piece of land with a creek along the south edge, and a meadow that goes golden in August, and 8 acres of Indiana woods that nobody in the world can take from them. Daniel came to see me last Sunday, alone. He drove out from Indianapolis by himself and sat at my kitchen table and drank 2 cups of coffee and told me he was sorry for standing by the dining room door and saying nothing while his wife held my work over a trash can. He looked me in the eye when he said it. I told him, yes, you should have said something. He took it without deflection. We sat with it for a moment, the way you sit with a true thing, and then we moved on. I told him I loved him. I told him that when his baby comes, I will be there if I'm invited. I told him that I will not come to his house until Amber looks me in the eye and apologizes. Not for my pride and not because I am keeping a ledger, but because there is a child coming who will grow up watching how the adults in their life treat each other. And I want that child to grow up knowing that what happened at that shower was not acceptable, and that the person it happened to did not pretend otherwise. He nodded, the slow, deliberate nod that is his father's nod, the one that means something has landed and he is taking it seriously. I walked him out to his car in the long evening light. He hugged me in the driveway and held on for a breath longer than usual, and I could feel everything he had not said pressed into that extra moment. I patted his back the way I have since he was small enough to fit in the crook of my arm. I told him to drive safe. I stood in the driveway and watched the taillights until they turned the corner. Then I went back inside. I sat in my chair. I took out the hat I had started the week after the shower, soft cream merino with a small cable down the center, newborn size. And I listened to the radio and watched the last of the evening light settle over the yard. That cedar chest is full. It has the blanket and Frank's letter in its sealed envelope and the certified copy of the deed with the county stamp on the front. It has the booties I finished the week after the shower. It has the anniversary quilt and 3 generations of careful things, folded one on top of another in the order they were placed there. That is what being old means to me. Not invisible, not disposable, not simple. It means you have had 72 years to learn which things are worth keeping and how to keep them, and when to fold them carefully into something soft and carry them across a room, and trust that eventually the right person will understand what they are holding. No designer item in the world can tell a child that their grandfather loved them before they had a name. No $1,400 stroller can carry a letter written over 3 evenings in autumn light by a man who knew he was running out of time. No brand, no aesthetic, no curated list can replace what 40 years of a life looks like when it is folded quietly into wool. If this story moved you at all, please leave me a comment. Tell me your own story. Tell me about someone who underestimated you and found out later they had been wrong. Tell me about something you kept quietly for years because you knew the right moment was coming and you were willing to wait for it. I read every single comment. Every one. Being old is not the same as being disposable. What I folded into that blanket were decades of love, of quiet preparation, of everything money cannot buy. And no trash can in this world was going to erase that.